Sophie Greenway adjusted the scarf around her neck as she observed the cloudy autumn sky in Portland, Oregon. The air was cold and damp, typical for the season, and the sidewalks around the hospital where her father, Frank, was admitted were blanketed with red and orange leaves. For weeks now, he had been battling a severe case of pneumonia, something that had escalated quickly, landing him in the ICU. Sophie, 37, had visited several times already, but this time felt different, as though an unsettling anxiety had taken hold in her chest. As she entered the hospital, she was greeted by the sterile, impersonal atmosphere, the strong scent of disinfectant, fluorescent lights casting a pale glow over the corridors, and bluish-white walls that seemed to amplify the silence around her. On her way to Frank's room, Sophie noticed the tired faces of other visitors, and, for a moment, she realized that she herself was more exhausted than she'd admitted. Her father's room was in the hospital's north wing, and when she entered, she found Frank lying in bed, tubes in his nose, breathing heavily, but with his eyes open. He slowly turned his head to look at her and, despite his evident frailty, tried to smile. "Sophie," he murmured, his voice rough as if each word took considerable effort. "I'm glad you came." She walked over and held his hand, feeling the cold, thin skin almost translucent. Despite the fear and pain of seeing her father so vulnerable, Sophie smiled, trying to appear calmer than she felt. They spoke for a few minutes about trivial things, the weather, her job as a social worker, and how the doctors were optimistic about Frank's recovery. But before she could say goodbye, he gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "Sophie, I need to tell you something before it's too late," he said, his voice filled with an urgency she had never seen in him. "There's something you need to know about our family." Confused and a little frightened, Sophie nodded, feeling her heart race. "Of course, Dad. What is it?" Frank took a deep breath as if bracing himself to reveal a burden he'd carried for years. "There's a secret about your mother and about who you really are." The revelation hung in the air, and Sophie felt as if the ground were about to open beneath her feet. Her mother, Ellen, had died when she was a child and had always been described by Frank as a kind, loving woman. "What do you mean by that, Dad?" she asked, her voice low and hesitant. He closed his eyes, seeming to gather courage, and then spoke. "Your mother, Ellen, wasn't who you think. And, Sophie, neither am I." Sophie stood frozen, staring at her father, her mind racing. The words had barely registered, and a part of her wanted to believe it was just the fever speaking, or maybe the toll of the illness on his mind. But the steady, serious look in Frank's eyes told her that he meant every word. She felt a chill run down her spine as he struggled to sit up, his grip on her hand surprisingly firm. "Your mother, she wasn't just Ellen Parker," he said in a voice so low it was almost a whisper. "She had another life before I met her, a past I never told you about. And I swore to keep it buried, for your sake." Sophie's mind scrambled to understand, but each word only led to more questions. "Another life?" she echoed, the confusion evident in her voice. "Dad, I don't understand. What are you talking about?" Frank closed his eyes for a moment, his face contorted with both pain and regret. Ellen wasn't her real name, he admitted, as if the words themselves were painful. "She changed her identity before we met. She had reasons, and I promised her I would protect that secret, even after she was gone." Sophie pulled her hand back slowly, feeling as though she no longer knew the man lying in front of her. Memories of her mother flooded her mind, gentle images of a woman who had baked cookies with her on weekends, who had told her bedtime stories every night until she passed away when Sophie was just 8. How could any of this be true? What was her real name then? Sophie demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. She could feel a pit forming in her stomach, a dread that grew with each passing second. Her father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked away, as though the shame and sorrow were too heavy to bear. Her name was Emily Warren, he finally whispered. She was hiding from someone or something. I didn't know the whole story myself. She kept parts of it hidden from me too, even as her husband. But I know she was afraid. Sophie's hands trembled. Afraid of what? Dad? Who was she hiding from? The room seemed to close in around her, the sterile smell of the hospital suddenly suffocating. All her life, Sophie had believed in the story her father had woven about her mother, a narrative that now felt hollow and fabricated. Frank's gaze softened, his face etched with guilt and sorrow. I never asked enough questions. I was so in love with her that I didn't care who she was before. I wanted to help her escape, to be her safe place. But there were shadows in her past, Sophie. She told me once that she'd done things she wasn't proud of, and that people might come looking for her one day. Sophie felt a surge of anger rise up. How could her father have kept something like this from her? How could he have let her grow up with an illusion? Why didn't you tell me? You let me believe a lie my whole life, Dad. Didn't I deserve to know? Frank's shoulders slumped, defeated, his voice barely audible. I wanted to protect you, Sophie. I thought the past had died with her. I thought you'd be safe if you didn't know. But his voice cracked. Last month, someone contacted me. A man asking questions about Emily Warren. He knew things about her, about us, things no one else should know. Sophie's heart pounded as she absorbed his words. It was no longer just a mystery, but a threat from a past that might come crashing into her present. And as her father's words sank in, she realized she was no longer just visiting a sick man in a hospital room. She was standing at the edge of a dark revelation that could change her life forever. Sophie felt as though her entire world had been turned upside down, every memory now laced with doubt. She left her father's room with a mix of anger and sorrow, unable to shake the feeling of betrayal. The air outside the hospital was cold and damp, a misty rain starting to fall, but she barely noticed as she made her way to her car. As she gripped the steering wheel, her mind raced, replaying every word her father had said, the pieces of her mother's hidden past stirring uneasily in her thoughts. The next morning, Sophie found herself in her father's old study, a room she'd barely entered since moving out years ago. She had no clear plan, but felt compelled to search, to dig through whatever remnants of her mother might be left in hopes of understanding the truth. Stacks of dusty books lined the shelves, and the faint smell of his cigars lingered in the air. Her fingers trailed over boxes, old photo albums, and finally, an antique wooden box she'd never seen before, tucked away in the far corner of the bottom drawer. With hesitant fingers, Sophie opened the box, her pulse quickening as she pulled out a small stack of papers. At the top was a yellowed envelope addressed to Emily Warren in neat, slanted handwriting. Her mother's name, her real name. She took a deep breath and unfolded the letter inside. Emily, it began. I know I promised not to contact you again, but it's urgent. They're still looking. No matter how far you go, they won't stop. I hope you've managed to start over, to live a new life. But if you ever feel you're in danger, use the enclosed number. I'll be there as promised. The letter was signed with a single initial, J. Sophie's heart raced. This wasn't just a remnant of her mother's past. It was a warning, a threat that had haunted her mother even in her new life. Whoever J was, they knew something about the people her mother was running from. And the fact that her father had kept this meant he'd known more than he let on. As she sifted through the rest of the papers, Sophie found more, scraps of Emily's life from before, including a passport photo of a young woman who barely resembled the mother she remembered. She looked confident, almost defiant, her expression hard and guarded, her hair darker than her mother's had ever been. This was a stranger, a woman with secrets hidden behind those eyes, secrets Sophie felt determined to uncover. Her phone rang, jolting her back to the present. It was a number she didn't recognize, and for a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail. But something made her pick up. Sophie Greenway speaking. She answered, her voice tense. There was a pause. Then a man's voice came through, low and deliberate. Is this Emily Warren's daughter? Her breath caught. Who is this? She demanded, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. The man hesitated before answering. Let's just say I'm an old friend of your mother's. I heard about your father's condition. I thought it was time I reached out." Sophie felt a surge of dread. The mysterious friend clearly knew more than he was saying, and his timing was too precise to be coincidental. "Why now?" she asked, gripping the phone tightly. "Why did you wait until now to contact me?" "I think you already know the answer to that," the man replied. "The truth has a way of surfacing, Sophie, even after all these years. There are people still interested in Emily's past. People who won't stop until they get what they're after. And I'm afraid they found a trail." Before she could ask more, the line went dead, leaving her alone with the weight of his warning. Sophie's hands shook as she lowered the phone, the enormity of her situation sinking in. She was now tangled in the very past her parents had hidden from her, and whoever these people were, they were closer than she'd ever imagined. In the days that followed, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow on the street, every stranger in a crowd, setting her nerves on edge. Her father remained silent about the details, his health deteriorating with each passing day, leaving her with only fragments of a story she barely understood. But she knew one thing. Whatever her mother had been running from, it hadn't stayed buried. And now it was up to her to uncover the truth before it found her first. The following evening, Sophie returned to the hospital with her mind churning, desperate for answers. The phone call from the mysterious man lingered in her mind, his words as haunting as they were cryptic. She found herself rushing down the cold, echoing halls of the ICU, her heart pounding as she neared her father's room. She didn't know how much time he had left, and the thought filled her with urgency and dread. She couldn't let him leave her without explaining everything. When she entered the room, her father was asleep, his face pale against the stark white hospital pillows. Guilt flickered in her chest at the thought of waking him, but she had no choice. "Dad," she whispered, gently touching his arm. He stirred, his eyes slowly opening to meet hers. She could see confusion and fatigue in his gaze, but he managed a weak smile. "Sophie," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You're here." Without wasting a moment, Sophie sat down and leaned in close. "Dad, I need you to tell me everything. About Mom, about her past, about what's happening now. I found her letters. Someone called me, an old friend of hers. He said people are still looking for her, that they found a trail." Her father's eyes widened, a flash of fear passing over his face. His frail hand reached out to grasp hers. "I didn't want this for you, Sophie. I wanted you to be safe, to live a normal life," he whispered, his voice trembling. "But it seems her past has finally caught up with us." Sophie's heart clenched. "You don't have to protect me, Dad. I deserve to know the truth." Her voice wavered, but she steadied herself, meeting his gaze with a resolve she hadn't felt before. Who were those people, and what were they after? Frank closed his eyes, as though gathering the strength to share a truth he had long buried. When he opened them again, his expression was solemn. "Your mother, Emily, was involved with some dangerous people. It was a different life. She was young, vulnerable, and they exploited that. She knew things they would kill to keep hidden. When she escaped and became Ellen Parker, we thought we were free. But she always feared they'd find her one day." Sophie felt a chill spread through her. What kind of people?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Powerful people, Sophie. Influential, well-connected," Frank said, his words barely audible. "She was involved in things she shouldn't have been, a web of crime and betrayal. When she tried to get out, they came after her. That's why she had to disappear. That's why she changed her name, her entire identity." Sophie's mind spun, trying to comprehend the weight of her father's words. Her mother had been running from more than just a troubled past. She'd been hiding from powerful enemies, people who might still be out there, still searching for the secrets she'd carried. And now, those secrets seemed to be hunting Sophie too. Her father took a shallow breath, his eyes distant. "I thought they'd forgotten about her. I thought we were safe. But if they found you, Sophie, you have to be careful. They won't stop until they find what they're looking for. And if they believe it's with you," his words faded, but the implication hung heavily in the room. Sophie swallowed hard, feeling the walls close in around her. She'd walked into this hospital as a daughter, visiting her ailing father. But now she was a target, entangled in a legacy of secrets and danger she'd never imagined. With a fierce determination she barely recognized in herself, Sophie knew she couldn't let her mother's past control her future. She would have to confront these shadows herself and discover the truth, no matter what it cost. Sophie spent the night in her small apartment, surrounded by fragments of her mother's hidden life. The letter addressed to Emily Warren, the old passport photo, and the words of warning from her father, still fresh and raw. The mysteries seemed to pulse around her, as if they had a life of their own, haunting her thoughts and filling her with a sense of dread. She knew there was no turning back now. She had to uncover the truth before it swallowed her whole. The next morning, Sophie decided to start with the only clue she had, the letter from Jay. The handwriting was distinct and careful, and she couldn't help but wonder who this Jay was and why her mother had trusted him enough to keep his contact information close. Sophie dialed the number listed on the letter, her hand shaking as she held her phone to her ear. It rang several times, and just as she was about to hang up, a gruff voice answered. "Who's calling?" the man asked, his tone guarded. Sophie took a deep breath. "My name is Sophie Greenway. I'm Emily Warren's daughter," she said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. She heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Emily's daughter," he repeated, his voice laced with surprise and perhaps a hint of fear. There was a long pause, and Sophie could almost feel him weighing the risk of speaking to her. "I never thought. She swore she'd keep you safe. Are you alone?" "Yes," Sophie replied, glancing around her empty apartment. "I found your letter. My father, he told me some things, but I need to know the truth. He said people were looking for her, that they might be looking for me now." The man sighed heavily. "Listen, Sophie, your mother was in deep with dangerous people, an organized ring with more influence than you'd believe. She was forced to work for them, but she knew too much. When she tried to break free, they marked her. She disappeared, changed everything, but she always knew it was just a matter of time before they caught on." A cold shiver ran down Sophie's spine. "But why now? She's been gone for years. Why would they come after me?" The man hesitated. Emily was involved in a cover-up of, let's just say, information that could bring down powerful people. She had documents, files, things she hid before she left them. If they think those documents are still out there, they'd do anything to retrieve them. Sophie's heart pounded, the walls of her apartment seeming to close in. "Do you think they believe I have them?" "It's possible," the man replied, his voice grim. "But listen carefully, Sophie. If they know who you are, they won't hesitate. You need to find whatever your mother hid and destroy it, or they'll keep coming." The reality of her situation hit her like a wave. She was no longer just a woman seeking answers about her mother's past. She was now a link in a chain her mother had tried desperately to break. And as the line went dead, Sophie knew that the time had come to go deeper, to follow the clues wherever they might lead. The next day, Sophie returned to her father's house, bracing herself for what she hoped would be the final pieces of the puzzle. The truth was almost within reach, but each answer brought more danger. As she entered the old study once more, her heart pounded with both fear and resolve. She had to find those documents before anyone else did. Her search was meticulous. She moved through the room slowly, lifting books, pulling out drawers, checking every inch of her father's old desk. After hours of searching, Sophie was nearly ready to give up when she noticed something odd about the base of the bookshelf. One of the boards seemed slightly loose, as if it had been tampered with. Heart racing, she pried it open and discovered a thin, dust-covered folder wedged inside. With trembling hands, Sophie opened the folder. Inside were several worn pages, faded photographs, and what looked like confidential reports. The names were unfamiliar, but the context became clear. These documents exposed illegal activities, fraud, bribery, violence. And at the bottom of one report, she saw a familiar face. A man who had recently risen to a prominent political position in Washington. The depth of her mother's knowledge hit Sophie with full force. Emily had been running from people who were now more powerful than ever. As she closed the folder, Sophie heard a sound. A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around and came face to face with a man dressed in a dark suit, his face cold and emotionless. I'm afraid I can't let you keep those, he said, his voice smooth but menacing. We've been looking for Emily's files for a long time, and I believe they belong to us. Sophie clutched the folder tightly, her mind racing. You're too late. My mother died protecting these, she said defiantly, though her hands were shaking. And if you harm me, the world will know everything. I made sure of it. The man's expression faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing as he calculated his next move. You've inherited her courage, he sneered, taking a step closer. But courage won't save you. Hand over the documents, and I might let you walk away. In that moment, Sophie knew that no matter what she chose, her life would never be the same. Summoning every ounce of strength, she took a step back and spoke with all the calm she could muster. No, I'm not my mother. I'm not running. These files will come to light, and your power will crumble. The man's face contorted with rage, but before he could advance, footsteps sounded from the hall. A nurse's voice called out, "Security will be here any moment." The man scowled, realizing his time had run out. Without another word, he slipped through the door, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Sophie clutching the evidence that could expose her mother's killers. In the days that followed, Sophie met with a trusted journalist, someone she knew could expose the truth safely. The story made national headlines, unraveling a web of corruption and deceit. The powerful figures who had hunted her mother were brought to justice, their influence destroyed by the evidence Emily had protected all those years. As Sophie walked away from the courthouse after the final conviction, she felt the weight of her mother's past lift from her shoulders. She would never forget the sacrifices her mother had made, or the price she'd paid for the truth. But for the first time, Sophie felt free, a freedom her mother had fought so hard to give her.